Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Podcast Laredo. As your co hosts, Fernando Montemayor and I, Antonio Alvarado, are privileged to delve into the historical and cultural takeaways of the Laredo ecosystem. That includes talking about individuals who reside in Laredo, who were born in Laredo, who visit Laredo, who just love Laredo. Today, Fernando and I welcome a very special guest, a distinguished lawyer in Laredo, David Almaraz. I'm going to ask Fernando to also give us a few introductory remarks. Fernando.
Thank you, Buddhist, and we're real happy to have you here today. And we're looking forward to today's conversation. I'm sure it's going to be very exciting.
All right. With that in mind, we will introduce our guest. His name is David Almaraz. David is quite unique. He's going to tell us more about what makes him unique. But what's remarkable about David is the journey that he has been on. So much so that we know already that we're going to need more than just one episode of this podcast that showcases David Almaraz. Welcome, David, and tell us how you're doing.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Fernando. Doing well. I have been a practicing lawyer going on 48 years this November. But people think I've always been a lawyer, and no. I was born in Hebbronville at my home. A nice midwife brought me into this world. My parents, Lupita and Reynaldo Almaraz, were absolutely great parents. Grew up in a low to middle class neighborhood there in Hebbronville. And again, I've asked people, how far do you remember? I think I remember when I was probably 2. And my first education was at the local Catholic school. It's called Little Flower School, run by, I believe, the Salesian sisters. I may be wrong. And about a couple of blocks away was the Franciscan friars that had gotten there in the mid-20s. The first 3 or 4 years of my education were with those sisters. Still remember the classes. They used to call it kindergarten, pre-primer, first and second grade. A lot of those friends of mine that I started school with are still around, and we still get together. But a lot of them are gone, obviously. The public school was small, but had some very good teachers all through elementary, junior high, and high school. In junior high, I had a Mrs. Rogers who, they would take you under their wing and say, David, I like that you love to read a lot, and so I'm going to read this book, read that book. I was lucky that my dad bought an entire volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica from a traveling salesman, and I went through it from the very first to the last book. Since there was very little to do in Hebbronville, I would go in the afternoon to the local county library, and that's how I learned about the rest of the world. And that's what I would tell people who didn't like to read. I said, look, the sun does not come up and set in Hebbronville. There's a big world out there. And that's what kept me going. I always liked to read. My 4th and 5th grade teacher would ask me to read out loud, and I would. There was a wonderful little old lady, 6th grade, Mrs. Peters, that thought I could sing. So she would bring me up to the front of the class and have me sing anything from the latest Elvis tune to the Everly Brothers. I guess from the very start, you could say that I was a ham, and that stayed with me growing up. I never grew much taller than I am today, right? I'm vertically challenged, as they say, but so I never tried for sports. I would just be either the water boy or something. But when I got to high school, my freshman year, I met a teacher named Lawrence Ray Smith. I must have been around 14. And he took me aside and said, David, I'm going to make a speaker out of you. He managed to put me in every single UIL competition that existed. Starting in my freshman year, I was in the one-act plays that would go and compete. I was in the debate team. And we did very well. We would go all over South Texas. And I remember in 64 going to a match in Goliad. And that's when I started finding out slight differences. They put all the Mexican-American kids in Mexican-American homes and the others in the other homes. I said, that's interesting. But again, we showed them. We won first place. We must have taken 20, 25 gold medals. Mr. Smith and my band director, Robert Sexton, would always tell us, you guys can do whatever you want to do. Nothing should hold you back. Just speak well, present yourself well, and you'll do okay. It was just those teachers, and I'm just mentioning two, but there was others, very good teachers. We were very fortunate in Hebbronville. It was a small school, about 300 students, but somehow Hebbronville managed to attract the very best teachers. Leo Coronado was our teacher who wound up in San Antonio leading the Audie Murphy Hospital. Leo Saavedra, who came to Laredo and became dean of the local college. Those were our high school teachers. And those are the ones that would tell us our life story of growing up and would tell us, you can be whatever you want to be.
David, let me unpack
Yeah, go
some of
ahead.
that information and take you back a little bit to growing up in Hebron. First of all, Hebron is unique because when we were growing up in Laredo, at least Fernando and I, Hebbronville was not on our radar. It wasn't a place that we would go to as a destination unless there was relatives there. We'd drive through Hebbronville. So how large of a place was Hebbronville? And basically what kept people in Hebbronville?
Hebbronville is the county seat of Jim Hogg County. It's never been incorporated. The population has always fluctuated between 4,000 and 5,000 people. When I was growing up, it was mainly ranching, county government, and the school district. So you're absolutely right. As soon as you graduated, there was very little to keep you there. And whoever could afford it or had the determination would say, I think I'll go to college, or I think I'll go to a bigger city and try to make it. My brothers, who all graduated in the 50s, all wound up in California to work on the aircraft at McDonnell Douglas, because back then, the only jobs, like I said, is working in the country, and you're lucky to make $5, $10 a day. Whereas California in the early 60s, they gave you a pretty good salary. But again, it was a very small town. And
Right.
it still is.
And it's even more amazing then that you seem to describe really first quality educational systems, the Little Flower School, Hebbronville Public Schools, and you speak very highly of your teachers and even remember their names. Kudos to you and the people in Hebbronville for having done that. Let's talk about what did your dad do if there wasn't that much to engage in jobs? You said school district or possibly agriculture. Did your dad work in either of those industries?
My dad would tell us stories of growing up during the Depression, as most of our parents did, and going to the war. But in my earliest years, my dad actually traveled all around Texas, drilling water wells, East Texas, West Texas. And that's when he first started telling me about, how can I put it, discrimination against our people. And so that's what he did until I was about 10 or 11. No, I take it back. He also met some military men, some generals at the Cadillac bar in Laredo, found out what he did for a living and asked him to come down to Torreon to drill some water wells for the government. And he accepted. So I was fortunate to spend 2 or 3 summers in Gomez Palacio from the end of school till school started again. Later on, he was fortunate to buy his first Caterpillar tractor. And I remember he was one of the first Latinos to have a tractor of his own that the bank would actually loan you money to get one. So he started doing that and started doing brush clearing for probably 20 years or more, 25 years. But very little education. My dad had to drop out like most men his age, most boys. He had to drop out probably about 5th grade to start working to help his family. My mom was Benavides. She was valedictorian of her 8th grade class, and her parents said, that's enough education. Women should be at home. And she married my dad when she was about 17. A very close-knit family. I had 3 older brothers, and I was the youngest.
How long was your dad gone to Mexico? Would you all go with him?
We would spend all summer with him. He would go and do work. Of course, being Torreon, and back then the roads weren't what they are now. There were literally 2-lane highways between here and Monterrey. And we remember stopping along the way, Sabinas, and I remember Mamulique Pass. Very dangerous roads, a lot of accidents. He would stay in Torreon pretty much all year and would come home at least once a month. And Mom would say, let me tell you what David's been doing so you can get him. Yeah, we were pretty much raised by our mom while he was gone.
When he went to Mexico, you said you went with him?
Yes, he would bring us along during the summer. So I would be there June, July, and August. Had the time of my life. We stayed at this, they called them courts at those days. I think it wasn't the California courts in Gomez Palacio. I'd get out in the morning and get together with the owner of the motel's son and just go try to find candies and good times anywhere. So to me, I still remember the sights and the sounds of old Mexico, 53, 54, 55.
Well, it's obvious that even though your parents didn't have a lot of formal education, they were very educated people in the sense that they had to graduate from the School of Hard Knocks experience and facing the discrimination that was perhaps more prevalent at that time. And they continued to instill certain values in you. And I want to talk a little bit about those values. How were you able to keep to the straight and narrow and focus on graduating and then pursuing the career track that you later did? Did you all talk a lot about values, or is it lead by example? How was that instilled in you?
My dad, you're right, even though he had almost no formal education up to the 5th grade, he was, to me, one of the most intelligent men that I've ever met. He loved to read. He could sit down and talk with anybody, even the wealthiest. In his later years as a tractor operator, he would work for the Iturria family down in Raymondville. He would tell us of actually being there doing work, and the owner, Fausto Iturria, said, hey, Ray, I want you to come have some dinner with us tonight. Nelson Rockefeller flew in and got to meet him and had long conversations with him. Everybody loved my dad. I've seen books written by Diane Malouf about all the biggest ranchers in Texas, from here, with the Benavides, all the way to the valley. And I dare say that my dad knew them all. And I'm just sorry that he wasn't around when the book came out. The values that he taught us, and my mom, obviously, I learned just by watching him, by seeing him. When we were in Gomez Palacio and in Torreon, we'd be driving down the road, and I would see kids eating from garbage cans, and he would stop and give them money. He was not a very religious man, but every year he would give money to the church, not only in Torreon or Gomez Palacio, but in Hebbronville. My mom was very religious and would take us to church every Sunday. But also, yes, Dad always said, the first brother that went to school was my brother Noni, who passed away 2 years ago. He actually went to St. Mary's. He graduated at 16 from high school. But at that age, he couldn't find himself. He came home after a year and did very well, started working for the bank and all that. I was fortunate to be the first of us in my family to graduate from college. But again, Dad always would tell me, I want you to go to college and do the very best you can. In fact, he wanted me to go to USC or UCLA, but I said, no, it's too far and costs a lot of money.
Well, interestingly enough, you obviously spent quite a bit of time in Torreon, and now I've always known you as an individual who spoke very good Spanish and was able to navigate the stream, as they say, in a bicultural way very effectively. And did you pick up a lot of your Spanish from those traveling trips to Mexico? Did you take Spanish courses at school? How did you learn to speak so well in Spanish?
I learned it at home and with all my tios and tias. They didn't speak English. So if you wanted to get fed, you have to learn Spanish. So I pretty much grew up bilingually. And again, my summers in Mexico, I picked up a lot of Spanish there. My dad was always wanting us to see the world. So once or twice in the summer times, he would make us all jump into his 52 Pontiac and would drive us all the way down to Mexico City. And I still have pictures of us in front of the Chapultepec or the Xochimilco, those little boats. And again, going through towns like Matehuala and San Luis Potosí. So that's where I learned my Spanish, at least what they say is correct Spanish. Because I will tell you that the nuns didn't appreciate our speaking Spanish. So they would try to get us to speak only English. So it was very simple for us to pick up both languages. With our friends, we spoke mainly English, but with all your relatives, you had to speak Spanish. And that's how I picked it up.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's fascinating that you were able to do that. And obviously, Fernando, one of the things that we want to visit about in our podcast, Laredo, is to give historical context to what is happening today versus what was happening in the past. The one connection here, Fernando, that David has brought to mind is the ease with which he and his family would travel in Mexico. Today, I would say diplomatically that it's quite a challenge if you decide to drive from Laredo to anywhere in Mexico. Fernando, how do we get our audience engaged, especially some of the younger members who may think that what is transpiring today was, in fact, what was transpiring many years ago when you and I and David could travel much more freely and have more interaction with friends and family in Mexico?
I think the only way we can relate that is by telling them the story like they're doing. And they'll probably look at us and say, you were crazy. But no, it was so safe to travel back then. And we truly enjoyed it, going to the bullfights or just to eat at the restaurants. No, it was very safe. And I think it's sad, but hopefully in the future, things will change and we'll go back to the way it used to be.
Let me add
and
to that. My older brothers, they must have been at that time 14, 15. They'd be up in Torreon, down in Torreon with my dad, and school was about to start. So they would actually jump on a bus on their own and come from Torreon to Nuevo Laredo, cross, and either take a bus or hitchhike to Hebbronville. We learned to be independent very quickly. You had to be. But again, thankfully, Mexico was so safe. You didn't have to worry about it. Everybody looked out for you. Now I can go to Laredo and haven't for the last 20 years. It's just crazy.
Yeah, no, it's pretty mind-boggling, as they say. So let me direct our attention. I'm going to share our screen and do a little bit of a retrospective here of some photos that David graced us with. So let me see if we can recollect a few of the highlights of early part of your journey, David. So what is this? An early courtroom presence.
Of course, chronologically, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. We went to UT, got our bachelor's and our master's, and finally wound up at St. Mary's Law. That is a picture of me being sworn in by a state district judge in Midland in November of 1977.
All right, let's go to our next one. Who is this?
That is starting private practice in Laredo, 1802 Houston, after having served for 5 years as an assistant U.S. attorney, and decided to hang up my own shingle. But that is me in 1985.
All right. And the reason we fast forwarded is to lay the predicate for this next slide, which is going to take us back to your high school days, because you did mention Atticus Finch. Tell us a little bit about what this book represents. These are photographs you shared with us, and we'll put ourselves back on screen, but who and what? Is this a book? Is this something you own?
That is my personal copy, and I have it right.
Let's read this book.
This is my autographed copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, signed by Harper Lee.
All right, David,
Yes.
show
Well,
us
the
the
book.
book and the autographs.
I was fortunate to have a friend that was traveling through Monroeville, Alabama, stopped at Harper Lee's home, had a chat with her, and I was able to have this book signed by Harper Lee, and she mailed it to me. Her name's Johanna Lieber, whom I met. She was from Rio Grande City. We met at a spelling bee in Corpus. Oh, I was a spelling champion in 8th grade in Hebbronville.
Because
60 words.
this is great, Fernando, because you are also a voracious reader. And this is a book that obviously had an impact on David. He's mentioned Atticus Finch. And this will be a good time, Fernando, to engage David in a little give and take about reading, but particularly The Kill and Mockingbird and the impact it's had on his life. I'm going to let you all chat a little bit because you all read more than I do, or have more time to read, I should say, or make time to read. Let's talk a little bit about reading and how you go about doing that. Fernando, I'll let you handle that exchange.
Okay. Something that struck me really interesting with you read this book how old were you when you read this book?
I was fortunate to be given a copy of this book beginning of my junior year by Lawrence Ray Smith, my speech coach. He said, David, please read this book, and paid close attention to the lawyer, Atticus Finch's closing argument to the jury when he is defending Tom Robinson, a black man. And so I did. So at that point, we got the speech, we edited as much as they could. And he said, I want you to read this summation at the UAL event. So that's what started it. I was fortunate to get first place in the district, and I was fortunate to go to state with it. Amazingly, I came in second because the guy that beat me was also reading Atticus Finch. And so apparently it was a thing, but that is what got me interested in this book. And later on, I said, one of these days I might want to become a lawyer. It took me a long time from that junior year in high school to finally graduating to St. Mary's. I'll tell you what happened there. We applied, 2-3 of us, and were accepted at UT Austin. The main reason was because my distant cousin, Primo, René Ramirez, who was a pretty good football player, played for Darrell Royal. I still remember going to the local service station. It was about 3 blocks away. His dad ran it, Tomas Ramirez, and listening to the Southwest Conference game of the week, Texas playing the Aggies, and Ramirez scoring a bunch of touchdowns. So that led us to go to Texas. We wound up at UT Austin back in 66, right after graduation. That's where I met Tony, around 68, I would think, maybe earlier, 67. And that's another story. That's when I got back from Selma, Alabama, trying to make a little bit of money to save for college. When I graduated from UT, I really, at that point, didn't know what to do. I was going to go to Vista Volunteers, but a friend said, Noel, there's this really good program called Teacher Corps, and you can do it in San Antonio. You'll go down there and you'll teach in the barrio schools. At the same time, you'll be working on your master's. And so I did that. And for the next 2 years, I lived in San Antonio, taught at Storm Elementary, which is the San Antonio Independent School District. And it was in the southwest part of San Antonio, Zarzamora and Brady. And in 72, I got my master's of education as a result of that. Had my master's thesis.
David,
Yep.
what were your degrees in? Your undergraduate degrees were in what?
Undergraduate political science and speech. Okay.
And masters.
Yeah, when I was at UT, I had some very good professors, and they let me direct my own play. I remember it was called The Investigation. It was about the Holocaust, and was in several presentations. In fact, I remember us going up to Baylor. First time I'd ever been to Baylor, which is when I learned that you couldn't drink at Baylor, but that's another story. But that is how I got my degree. undergraduate at UT. But again, not knowing what I really wanted to do, I came down and not only got my master's, taught 2 more years at the Northside District. Before that, I met my first wife, Mary, who Tony met. And again, I think sometime in the middle of my second year of teaching at Gregorio Esparza, I decided that maybe teaching was a lot of fun, but it didn't pay the bills. So I said, maybe I'll go to law school. At that time is when I applied to 4 or 5 different schools. Most of them accepted me, except for Harvard. I have no idea why, but that's their loss. I got my degree in 77 from St. Mary's. And that's when I started practicing law. Went to Midland, as you saw in that picture. I managed to stay only 1 year. And some of the reasons, I can tell you, other reasons I'm not going to tell you, but mainly sandstorms, snowstorms, ice storms, tornadoes, and things that go bump in the night. And so I just decided, at that point, a friend of mine from Hebbronville was assistant DA in Rio Grande City, Starr County. So he called me and said, David, you want to come down and work in Starr County? I said, sure. And so I came back and started working in Starr County as the lone assistant DA for 2.5 years. That's where I got my feet wet. Good old trial experience, as I was the only one there. I probably tried 100 criminal cases with a small staff that I had there. Then, after about 2.5 years, I got a call from my good friend, Chito Davila, who had recommended Texas Tech, which is where he went. And I actually got accepted to Tech. Having lived in Midland, I said, that's too close to Midland, and I know what to expect in Lubbock. He called me. He was the Assistant U.S. Attorney here in Laredo. At that time, Laredo only had a one-man office. One man would leave, another man would take his place. And so I got in there, and again, getting your feet wet in federal court for 5 years. And they never wanted to raise my salaries. But I was fortunate to try probably from 250 to 300 felony jury trials in front of Judge Kazin. They would send me everywhere. They said, hey, David, you don't have anything else to do. They sent me to Corpus to try an attempted assassination of a federal judge. And I was able to get a conviction there. I would love to write a book. I have many memorable cases from my time prosecuting in Laredo. One of them was when they kidnapped the local bank president's dad, Mr. Keck, and were able to take a lot of money from the bank. And I was able to find those guys guilty. Of course, when you're a federal or state prosecutor, you're supposed to find them guilty. That's your job. If you don't win 90 or 95% of your cases, you better go find another job. But that was it. And so after 5 years, it was a decent salary, but I had just had our first child, and I decided to go into private practice. And that's what I did in 85.
So what went from prosecutor to a defense attorney?
Yes.
And that's like day and night, right?
It absolutely is. But I always tell people, when I was sworn in, just like Tony, we swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. So the same Constitution that I was defending as a prosecutor, I was also defending as a defense lawyer. It's the same rules, the rules of criminal procedure. But you're right. You don't just become a really good defense lawyer because you were a pretty good prosecutor. It's a whole nother ball game. What helped me, I think, was that I knew what I had to do to convict people. Anytime somebody came to me and said, look, this is what I did, or this is what they're accusing me of, then you turn it around. What is the prosecution going to throw at me so that I can defend this man? So that helped a lot. All my jury trials, you'd go to CLEs. I was in Washington, D.C. many times to just Department of Justice. But yes, it's what he said, it takes a good 5 years defense work before you can become a pretty good defense lawyer. And
so this will be a very good time to take a pause because we're about a little bit over 30 minutes, but you set up quite a rich journey that we're going to be exploring in the second half of our podcast, Laredo. We've been talking to David Almaraz, criminal defense attorney, noteworthy, well-known, recognized, successful. And we will be back with you after this brief pause. Let's welcome back David Almaraz. We're continuing with this wonderful narrative, his legal legacy, on podcast Laredo. We've been talking about his upbringing in Hebbronville, Texas, his formal education through the Little Flower School and Hebbronville Public Schools. He talked about what influenced him and how he continued that journey, became, in fact, a lawyer. But we skipped, obviously, his undergraduate journey at the University of Texas at Austin, and then his Master's of Education through the UT St. Mary's program. But he did talk about a book that influenced him, and that was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. In fact, he showed us an autographed copy of that book, which is quite rare. Fernando was talking to him about that book, so I'm going to punt back to Fernando and let you engage David on his reading of that book, and in fact, perhaps many other books that have influenced him and generated who he is today. So, Fernando?
Yeah, David, you were telling us about Till Mockingbird. It seems it made a big impression in your life and ruled where you went because of that and that teacher that you had. And who would have known that something like that was going to change a person's life? You've told us that you're an avid reader and that you read how many books a week?
I try at least for 2 a week.
2 a week. Is it fiction, nonfiction?
I like to read the classics, but depending on the length of the book, then it might be 1 a week. Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov, those type of books. But again, if I could, my freshman year, we were very fortunate to have a teacher, English teacher, Dave Oliphant, young, skinny guy from East Texas. He was very influential in our reading. He asked us to read probably 10 or 15 books for that semester. And I still remember some of them, books that I didn't ever think existed. For example, Of Mice and Men, Catcher in the Rye, all those books that you read them and you said, wow, this book really takes us to another world. And of course, Shakespeare, all the plays, everything that he asked us to read, we would read, and he would ask us, almost in law school, the next day, what did you think of this book, David? What did you not like? Dave Oliphant, bless his heart, is probably 85. The last 2-3 years, we had a reunion. We invited him. He was kind enough to come. He's living outside Austin. Came to find out that since he left Hebbronville, he's written about 25 books. He spent time in Chile, married a lady there. He was kind enough to bring us the books that he'd written and autographed them for us and gave them to us. And so anytime I have a chance, I sit down and read those books. I still call him. He's one of the few high school teachers that are still around, obviously. Most of them are in their 80s. One of them are in their 90s. But I don't know if Mr. Smith, or Dr. Smith, as he became, is still around. But it's amazing what one teacher in a small high school, we had 65 people in our senior class, how one teacher can affect the rest of your life. He would say, David, what are you and Jose Luis doing Saturday? Nothing. We're in Hebbronville. He drove us to Laredo to watch Lawrence of Arabia. And I was just blown away. I still love, to me, there's never been a better movie than Lawrence of Arabia. Anything by David Lean. But that was the type of teacher he was. He wanted to expand our worldview, and he wanted us to listen and see movies like that, but especially read books like that. I still remember reading those books in his class. Before I got to be in my teens, I told you all I would go to the library. And I think Malcolm X said this. He read the dictionary from cover to cover. And I did the same thing. Anytime I can have a thesaurus, and I have several in my library, I'll sit there and start with the first page. I like to learn new words every day if I can. So my love for learning and reading is still there. There's still a passion.
Do you remember when your love for reading started? What age were you?
I would think about fourth grade, the teacher would have us read a certain page from a certain story. And I would read. I guess the teacher liked the way I read it, to where they would say, you know what, you may have a future one of these days in public speaking. And so those are the type of teachers that you still remember to this day. In fact, Mrs. Peters, my sixth grade teacher, I remember calling her when I got my master's. And I called her, and she was so happy. She must have been 99 when she was teaching us, but those are the type of teachers that just stay with you and say, this teacher turned me on to this book or this type of reading. And that's how it happened.
When you read these books, are you the type that highlights them?
Yes.
Put notes on the side?
I like books. I don't like Kindle. I don't like reading off a pad. I like my books. Of course, I don't dog-ear them, but I'll highlight them. I'll put something to catch me. Again, if you study the world's greatest lawyers, Clarence Darrow, Jerry Spence, they spend all their free time reading, and they tell you, read the classics, the best. David Copperfield, read the classics, read Shakespeare, anything that will say, this is what you need to learn, because every time you read any type of book like the one I'm mentioning, certain paragraphs stay with you. And I've caught myself actually using them in a jury trial, using a certain phrase, and I remember what book it was from. Right now, to me, the greatest writers ever were the Russian writers and all their classics. Of course, English writers, innumerable. But I have a friend of mine from England, who's actually a professor here, and I said, how is it possible that an island as small as England could produce such geniuses in literature, in science? That's my bucket list. I want to go back to London soon. I want to go to Westminster Abbey and see where all of these geniuses are resting, their final resting place. Dickens, Charles Darwin, Newton, all those guys. So again, there is no type of book that I like all kinds of books, but especially history books. At home, usually the only thing I watch is the History Channel or a documentary channel. I'm not going to watch the cable news outlets. I spend my time yelling at the TV screen. But that's where my love of reading still comes.
Being a defense attorney, I would think you don't have a 9-to-5 job. So when do you find the time to do all this reading?
I have always, ever since I started private practice, I promised myself, go to your work, and this is when I started my own practice 40 years back. If you have a client that wants to see you, then go. But there's other things besides the practice of law. But again, most of the time, depending on the time I get home after dinner, I'll sit down in my library and start reading. And all you need is an hour and a half, and you'll get through a good portion of a book. Like Tony was saying, you have to make time. It's like you have to make time for your body to exercise. You have to, because I don't care what you do, but let's not get too morbid about it, but the thing that kills most people is stress. I've seen lawyers that work 7 days a week. They don't care about their staff's family. If I can, I never work on a Saturday or a Sunday as far as the law. That's where I go to the woods.
And David, speaking of books, you had mentioned when you were talking to us earlier in the first part of our podcast, Laredo, about selling Bibles in Selma, Alabama. Now, you talk about the good book. That is the good book. And I want to know a little bit more about that for several reasons. One, if I recall correctly, you mentioned it happened at a time when we were right in the middle of the civil rights activities that led to much of today's civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, et cetera. But also, it is fascinating that you would have a Mexican American kid from Hebbronville, Texas, selling Bibles in Selma, Alabama. But third, and more importantly, we want to know about your experience being so far away from home. It's not Torreon, Coahuila, Mexico, where people speak Spanish. It's a totally different culture. Yeah, take us to Selma, Alabama, and
The summer of 67, I can still remember the top 10 songs of that year. But yes, I got an opportunity. It was a company I'd never heard of, the Southwestern Company, advertised somewhere there on the drag, hey, you guys want to make some money? But they never told us what we were going to be doing for obvious reasons. If they had told us, most of us wouldn't have gone. So they said, no, we'll tell you when you get there. So 2 or 3 of us jumped in a car after checking with my parents. If you're going to make some money, good. So we wound up in Nashville, and it was like a 2-day Ross session. And they said, you're either going to sell Bibles or you're going to sell encyclopedias. What do you want? And he thought about it, and he said, where do I go for Bible? Alabama, the Bible Belt. I said, I'll take that one. A friend of mine and I jumped in a car and drove all the way down to, we went through Birmingham and another crazy place with Bull Connor, and wound up in Prattville. But it was such a small town that after 2 or 3 weeks, we had seen we knocked on every door of the little town. But it was always, you'd stay with some nice Christian family, and they'd say, oh, you're selling Bibles? Okay, you can stay here for $20 a week or something. After that, we told our supervisor, hey, we've gone through this whole town. Okay, have I got a town for you? And we wound up in Selma. And it was a good friend of mine that I still keep in touch with, Mike Lacine from Weimar, Texas, who I'd also gone to UT Austin. We got permission from this little old lady that we stayed at her place, también, probably $20 a week. And so what you would do every day, you would have samples of your Bible, of the big King James Version. I bought a bike with my first sales and managed to go through the entire town of Selma. And I still think of what I learned, the art of salesmanship, which has helped me to this day when I'm in front of a jury. You're selling yourself, as Tony, as a lawyer. You're not selling a Bible. You're selling yourself and your case. Very interesting anecdotes, and I'll give you a few of them. One of them was I was wearing glasses. I always wore these horn-rimmed glasses, and I broke them. So I asked somebody, where can I get them replaced? They said, oh, downtown at the store, this optometrist. So I went over there with my broken glasses one afternoon, and it was second floor. At getting to the top of the stairs, it says white, and it says colored. So I was confused. I didn't know which one to go into, but I said, I'll go with the white. I wasn't kicked out. So that was my first. And this is in 67, 3 years after the civil rights legislation had prohibited that. But hell, that's Washington. That's the Supreme Court. What can they tell us? That was one. Another, after a day of riding my bicycle and trying to sell these Bibles at $29.95, you would get a small deposit, $5, $10. The rest they would pay you when you turned over the Bible to them. So every evening we'd get our supper at a local hamburger place. We got to be good friends with the waitresses. They'd never seen Mexicans, at least one, before. But to me, it was almost like the famous scene in Easy Rider, because one day both Mike and I walked in, ready to order the waitress thought she'd play a joke on us. And she said, look at here, boys. Here's them Freedom Riders from up north. We nearly died because they looked at us like, really? And we know what had happened in Mississippi the years before. But she thought she was joking. But and then she said, oh, I'm just kidding, boy. These are Bible salesmen. They ain't here to do bad stuff. So that was another one. And of course, being very naive. Yes, I'd already been to a year in Texas, but very naive. So I would actually be trying to sell somebody a Bible, like some middle-aged white person. I'd say, sir, I'm sorry, why don't you let black people into your church? every Sunday. And they'd look at me like, and then I'd start asking questions about the Klan. Are there any Klansmen around here? I didn't realize I was probably talking to one of them. So that was another. I'm glad I made another alive. Another one, most of my Bible has sold in the black side of town, the black population. And I remember sitting on a porch one afternoon, something out of a Carson McCullers book, hot and steamy as usual, Delta Dawn. And I looked over in this big open field and there was this giant cross. And I said, is that like for services, worship? Oh, no. So it was a black guy telling me, an older black guy said, that's where they meet. They have their Klan meetings every Saturday night. And they light that cross. So it was, to me, and many years later, was something out of, oh, brother, where art thou? And these things still existed. It was still all white, city council, all white, everything. It started changing after a while, but those are things that stayed with me forever.
It is dramatic just hearing you talk about what you were facing and what you were living through, because those are historic times. And as much as we'd like to say, yes, things have gotten better, we know that experience has served you well as you advocate for the voiceless, as you represent many clients caught in the legal system and trying to seek justice. But Fernando, before we let him go off the hook on the reading part and the influence that his early life has given and provided and motivated David, is there anything else that we should ask David about in terms of his lifetime love of reading? It's almost like he is back at the university without being told that he has an assignment. He's reading the dictionary from A to Z. He's got 3 or 4 thesaurus. After a while, Fernando, I don't know, our guest may very well needs to go back to teaching. That maybe that's where we need him in schools today. What do you think, Fernando?
Well, ask David. What do you think, David?
I've been asked when I'll be retiring, and I've talked to a lot of friends about retirement. I've talked to doctors. They don't retire. Slow down in what you're doing, but they tell you about the fatal consequences of retirement. A good doctor friend of mine, you may remember it, Joe Gutierrez from Hebbronville. He retired. Of course, he doesn't follow his own advice. He said, David, if you retire, all you're going to do is sit in front of the TV and drink wine, which to me, that's not a bad idea, but I still feel I can make a difference in this world. So what I do, I'm slowing down to where if I don't have anything at the office, I won't come. I'll stay home and do what my wife says. But again, in 2009, I started the local chapter of the ACLU, and I'm still very passionate about that. And Fernando, you may know, I think you mentioned it, I'd like to write a few letters giving my opinion of what's happening in this world. And so again, without mentioning names, with this recent presidential election, everything that I think ACLU and other people have worked for is being reversed, is being thrown out the window. When I was in law school, and Tony, when you were in law school, we looked up to the Supreme Court. The Warren Court came up with the best cases ever to help the common man and to help define the Constitution. I hate to tell you that court no longer exists. Unfortunately, the court that exists today is just to do the bidding of certain people in power, and I'm horrified. But there is a local station here in town, Telemundo, where the local moderator apparently is in love with a local man in Washington. He was always inviting people to discuss why they like the current president and everything he's doing. And that's fine. But I called a local reporter that works there because she would come to interview me like every 2 or 3 months on something that was happening in Washington or in Austin. And I asked her, could you ask your main man there at Telemundo if I can be given an opportunity to go in and give my piece on what I think is happening? So they were kind enough to invite me. I sat down. I had about 10 different things I was going to mention of what I thought was happening since the inauguration. But the moderator told me, you only have 6 minutes, But little did I know he was going to take up 4 of those minutes. And so anytime I would start saying something, he would stop me and say, yes, but what about this? And what about that? But I still was able to get in a few licks in what I thought. And I mentioned the Constitution, and I mentioned executive orders do not override the Constitution. And that was it. And so they were very nice and said, maybe we'll invite you back again. Since then, I've gotten a few calls. Hey, we saw you the other night. And the one that's most interesting, a pastor called me 2 days ago. Says, Laredo, can you come to our church Sunday and tell our parishioners what their rights are? Because they're scared to go outside. So this Sunday, 2 days from now, I plan to go to this church somewhere in the middle of Laredo on the Heights and tell 50 or 60 people. I invited other lawyers that are experts at immigration because I'm going to tell them I'm a criminal defense lawyer, but I'm also in love with the Bill of Rights that so far still exists, even though they're crumbling. And at my office, I got 2 or 3 calls. They said they saw me and they agreed with me. And I said, speak out. But very few people like to speak out. A lot of these people think they're still in the Laredo of the 50s when you just didn't do that. You could lose your job if you expressed your opinion. And that's where we are right now.
All right, let me do this. We're going to share the remaining slides of the PowerPoint, which I think nicely dovetail into what you've just stated, which is getting onto the more serious, heavier content of your journey, which we hope to continue in a following episode. But before we close, as we're getting to the hour mark, I wanted to share a few slides from our PowerPoint for today's episode. And you can briefly comment on them because I do want Fernando to talk about one other interesting anecdote that we recall from our earlier conversation, which was one of the hobbies that you have to de-stress from what is a very active commitment to the profession. So if you hold on, let's share the screen. And if you recall, we left off with the Kill a Mockingbird. Let's move on to this slide. Tell us about this. It looks like your evil twin brother here, but I can't make him out. Who is this?
That is me being interviewed outside the old federal building. I think you can see the Hamilton Hotel in the background. And again, being the only prosecutor in town, federal prosecutor, any time I had a trial, because they would make the news, sometimes the TV people would show up. Sometimes they would ask about the case. And so I'm being interviewed there by someone about a certain trial, 1984.
All right, let's look at the caption here, which I took from one of the newspaper ads, I think a current one that you have running, and it's advocating for the voiceless, one case at a time. So you're true to your word. This is how you project your service to the public. Let's look at this other slide. Who is this very debonair looking gentleman?
They had just placed a bust of the late George Kazin, my mentor, in the federal building, and I was able to ask one of the guards if I could stand there and have a picture taken. So I did. When I got to Laredo to begin my career as a federal prosecutor, Judge Kazin had been on the bench 1 year. At that time, he was the youngest federal judge. I think he was not even 40 at the time. He and I, of course, you knew George Kazin like I did, Tony. He was not a very sociable person. So you couldn't say, George, let's go have a drink this afternoon. He just would not be seen anywhere where the appearance of impropriety. But you'd go into his chambers and he would tell you either you did well or you really pissed him off. But again, that's just the way he was. And his son is now a federal district judge, John Kazin, in that same court.
You spent quite a number of weeks, months, and years in your professional life at the federal courthouse, particularly the one in Laredo, both the previous one, which is the old post office building downtown next to the Hamilton Hotel, and now this new modern structure. So let's continue the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And we're going to talk to you about how you de-stress. And Fernando, do you want to engage David in a little bit of banter about what he does to decompress, what kind of hobbies he's got?
You told us, David, you have one special hobby, which I found real interesting, archery. Do you still practice that? Do you still go out and do that?
I do. I started when I was probably in high school, but I didn't know anything about it. It was the old bear archery fiberglass. And of course, nobody ever taught me. So the animals that I would hunt had nothing to fear from me. I never bagged a single animal, rabbits or otherwise. But it wasn't until I got to Rio Grande where you could not move without somebody saying, let's go hunting. And of course, if you were somebody in a certain position, like a district attorney, everybody would invite you. So that's when they got me interested in hunting, first of all. But at that time, I was using rifles like everybody did. Now, I started hunting in Hebbronville, since it's a very small country town. Where I grew up, my house was literally across the street, and there was the woods. So 4 or 5 years of age, I was out there chasing rabbits with a slingshot with my friends. But again, to me, there is nothing like the South Texas brush country, especially around wintertime. The smell of the mesquite, the yelps of a coyote. After a while, probably in the mid 80s, I decided to put away my rifle. I said, the rifle is nice, but you don't give the animal a chance. Why don't you start hunting whatever you want to hunt, but with a bow and arrow? At that time, I hunted with a compound bow. I went to 2 or 3 different states, but no rifles, only bows. So I was able to take, over the next 2 or 3 years, pretty nice elk. And it's about a 6x6. That's when I was younger, where I could climb mountains. Can't do that anymore. At least I don't think I can. But then I was able to harvest a mule deer in Colorado. And here in Texas, where I do most of my hunting, I've taken quite a number of white-tailed deer. To me, it was a challenge of trying to get closer and closer to the animal without him detecting you. And so I don't like to shoot any animal unless I think it's a trophy. It's an older animal. He's lived his lifetime. He's done his breeding. But to me, just being out in the woods, that's my de-stressing. That's my therapy. That's why I don't need to go see a psychologist, I don't think. I go to the woods and I stay there. Rarely do I spend the night, but just being there, just observing the animals, hearing all the wildlife. But yes, and then about 25 years ago, I started making it more difficult for myself by hunting with a recurve. And that is handmade recurve that was made for me by a gentleman in Pennsylvania. And a recurve is just a simple stick and a string. It has no sights. It has no pulleys or compounds or anything, to where it's the old Robin Hood, to where you pull, you hold it for a few seconds and release. You can't be just holding it forever. So to me, it has given me all the de-stressing I need. And I joke with people, it's like we start talking about how many years do you think you have left in this lifetime? But then how many hunting seasons do I have left? Because a lot of people give it up. No, I don't like it, and that's fine. I'll just take pictures. And I'm the same way. However, about 6 years ago, I was able to take the biggest buck of my life with a recurve. And to me, that was the culmination of what I was trying to do. It was an old buck, and again, but to me, there is nothing like hunting with a bow. I just don't hunt dangerous game. I'm not going to hunt wild hogs or anything like that. I try to tell everybody that'll listen, it's not that you want to go out and kill something. It's just going out there, try to get the opportunity, try to walk at least 20 yards from the animal. And that's why very few people are successful. Like I told somebody one time, I said, you never saw too many fat Indians. I said, they had to do whatever it took to get an animal to feed their family. And the word that comes up a lot is challenge, the challenge of bow hunting, which to me has always been, that's it. because most people will brag that they killed a deer at 300 or 400 yards. I say, no, try to get within 20 or 15 yards of an animal. Then tell me about hunting.
You said that your teacher in your younger years wanted you to sing. You had you sing in front of the class. Do you still sing?
I do. Don't get me close to a karaoke machine. I grew up listening to, well, I was in Torreon, the golden age of the cantantes. Jose Alfredo Jimenez, Jorge Negrete, Pedro Infante, and of course, all of us, Laredo or all of South Texas, swear, maybe after a few tequilas, that we can sound just like one of those guys. So yes, I still sing. I don't play the trumpet like I used to. I don't play the guitar, but as long as my voice still holds out, I do.
So next time Tony and I get together, we'll invite you over so you can sing for us.
It would be my pleasure. One more anecdote. This is when I was still in high school, when I was president of the student council. We went to San Antonio for a student council convention, and they had a talent show. And a friend of mine, he's gone now, Andy Guerra, was a really good musician. He played the guitar, and he was an all-state, a very complicated machine that I could never play. But anyway, he was my accompanist. And so I said, Andy, why don't you bring your guitar? So in front of probably 500 people at the Trinity Auditorium, I sang The House of the Rising Sun. And I thought I did pretty good. There was like 5 or 6 or 7 contestants. Of course, I came in second, and that was fine. Some lady that sang something from, she was probably one of the local ladies from the private schools. So she won. I hugged her and thanked her and all that. The next night, it was the final goodbye, and we were all having dinner. They asked me to sing it again. The guy that came in second, and I said, yeah, sure. Because that time I swore I sounded just like Eric Burden. But again, I don't know if I ever sang in front of Tony when we were roommates, but no, I've always liked to sing. That's true.
I guess before we close, Tony, if you could give your younger self advice, what would it be?
That's a very good question. Like all lawyers, I would say try to spend more time with your family when you're starting out. It's hard for a young lawyer just starting to spend time with your young people. Although I tried to do the best I could. It was like Cats in the Cradle and Harry Chapin. But I would say never forget the family, because they're there just for a little while. And then they grow up and they're gone. That's what I want to be. It's nice to be a success in the law or in medicine, but make sure your kids remember you as a loving dad. That's what I would say.
David, we can't thank you enough. This first episode, hopefully it will be a great preview for our listening audience. Sharing your personal stories, your anecdotes, really presents authenticity with our younger generation of who you are. And you obviously have a very strong message. I do want to recap what we're trying to do in Podcast Laredo is the idea that Fernando and I came up with, how to gain more insights of a historical and cultural nature about this border region, sharing those narratives through the eyes of residents, natives who were born here, who have returned here, others who call Laredo home because they visit it often. But varying perspectives and diverse insights are really important to us. We're not here to promulgate any agenda, political, religious, or otherwise, but we are here to share the stories of you and others who have made Laredo their home for any part of their journey, because it is through you, David, and others like you who have had challenges, barriers, struggles, and maybe some that continue to this day. But it's the idea that what you can accomplish is through looking at role models such as yourself, David, and realizing that it can be done. It comes at a cost, it comes at a price, but it is worthwhile. And to see you enjoying life with your family and being extremely proud, as well you should be, of your successes, is what this is all about. Fernando, that's my sermon for this week. Do you want to cap it off with an amen?
Amen. Yes. And I just want to say, David, we thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We've enjoyed listening to your insights and your stories, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much for both of you for the invitation. I'd love to meet again. One thing I did mention, or did not mention rather, you said, how did you get started into reading? I remember my dad always had 1 or 2 newspapers, including the famous Laredo Times, which I would go through and read about things happening all over the world. And then we used to get magazines. We got Look, we got Life. And I remember an ad in one of those magazines said, "Send me a man who reads." And that always stuck with me. And unfortunately, being a former educator, very few of our young people like to read. They'd rather be on their cell phone and don't know how to spell anymore. LOL. But anyway, thank you all so much. Thank you.